The dust of redemption, Texas, clung to everything, a fine, gritty powder that settled on hat brims and in the creases of worn leather. For Jebediah Stone, it was just a part of life, like the relentless sun or the scent of mesquite on the wind. He pushed through the swinging doors of the Thirsty Devil Saloon, the sudden dimness a relief from the afternoon glare. The air inside was thick with the familiar smells of stale whiskey, sweat, and cheap cigar smoke. He wasn't here to linger. He just needed to pick up a message from a drover, heading north and grab a bottle for the ranch. He nodded to the bartender, a man named Silas whose face was a roadmap of past brawls, and was about to state his business when a heavy hand clamped down on his shoulder. Well, look what the wind blew in. A dirt scratcher trying to drink with men. The voice was a low, slurring growl. Jebediah turned slowly. He knew the man instantly. Ranger Silas Kane, though the ranger part was more of a license to bully than a mark of law. Kane was tall and wiry, with a cruel twist to his lips and eyes that swam in a drunken haze. His Colt Peacemaker hung low on his hip, the handle worn smooth from use. "Kane," Jebediah said, his voice even. "I'm not looking for trouble." "Trouble found you, farmer," Kane sneered, poking a finger into Jebediah's chest. He reeked of cheap liquor. "You looked at me wrong when you walked in. I don't like being looked at wrong." The saloon had fallen quiet. The piano player's hands froze over the keys. This was Kane's game, manufacturing a slight, forcing a confrontation, and adding another notch to his reputation. "You're drunk, Silas," Jebediah said, standing his ground but making no move toward his own pistol. "Go sleep it off. I'll buy your next bottle when you're sober." The offer of perceived charity was like throwing oil on a fire. Kane's face purpled with rage. "You think you're better than me." He spat, his hand drifting down toward his gun. "I say you meet me in the street, right now, or are you as yellow as the corn you grow?" Jebediah's jaw tightened. He thought of his wife, Sarah, her warm smile. He thought of his boy, Thomas, his laughter echoing across their small patch of land by the creek. This drunken fool wasn't worth risking any of that. Pride was a luxury he couldn't afford. "No," Jebediah said, his voice low but firm, cutting through the silence. "I have no quarrel with you. I won't draw on a man who can barely stand. There's no honor in it." For a moment, Kane looked stunned by the direct refusal. The humiliation washed over his face, visible even through the drunkenness. He didn't draw. Instead, a venomous smile spread across his lips. "Honor," he whispered, the sound more menacing than any shout. "A man who won't defend his honor soon finds he has nothing left to defend. Remember that, farmer, when you're all alone in the dark." Without another word, Jebediah turned, collected his bottle from the stunned bartender, and walked out. He didn't look back, but he could feel the weight of Kane's threat, a physical presence at his back. The ride home to Stones Creek Ranch felt longer than usual, each hoofbeat a drum counting down to something terrible. The setting sun bled across the horizon, casting long, menacing shadows that looked like grasping fingers reaching for his home. The ride home had been a long one, each hoofbeat of his horse, Bess, a leaden drum against the hard-packed earth. Back at the homestead, the setting sun painted the vast Texas sky in hues of orange and violet, a beautiful lie that promised a peace Jebediah no longer felt. He tried to shed the saloon's stale air of whiskey and menace at the door, forcing a smile for his wife, Sarah, as she stirred a pot over the stove. The rich smell of beef stew filled their small, sturdy home, a scent of normalcy that felt fragile now. His son, Eli, a boy of 8 with his mother's bright eyes and his father's stubborn chin, ran to him, brandishing a carved wooden horse. "Pa, look, I made him a saddle." Jebediah knelt, his joints cracking, and examined the small toy with feigned seriousness. "That's fine work, son. The finest saddle in all of Crockett County." But his eyes kept drifting to the windows, to the growing twilight outside. Sarah set 3 bowls on the worn wooden table. Her gaze was knowing. "Everything all right in town, Jeb?" she asked softly, her voice a gentle counterpoint to the storm brewing in his gut. "Just business," he lied, hating the taste of the word. Silas Kane was there, running his mouth as usual. He omitted the duel, the threat. There was no need to burden her with his own foolish pride or another man's drunken rage. But the unease was a guest that wouldn't leave. After supper, as Sarah read to Eli by the flickering lamplight, Jebediah cleaned his Winchester, the familiar metallic rasp of the cleaning rod a small comfort. Later, with his family asleep, he stood on the porch, listening. The familiar chorus of crickets was there, but underneath it, something felt wrong. The wind whispered through the eaves with a different voice, a sibilant warning. His horses were restless in the corral, a soft, nervous whinny cutting through the quiet. He told himself it was just a coyote, a wolf maybe, but he knew. The first sound was the shattering of glass from the back window, an explosion of crystalline violence that ripped the night apart. Before he could even shout, the front door burst inward, splintering off its hinges. Figures, dark and indistinct against the starless night, flooded into their home. He didn't have time to aim. He only had time to shove Sarah, who had come running from the bedroom, towards Eli's room. "Get him! Hide!" A flash of fire erupted from the darkness. A searing pain tore through his shoulder, spinning him around. The Winchester clattered to the floor. Another shape loomed in his peripheral vision, swinging something heavy. He saw the glint of lamplight on a pistol barrel, heard a guttural laugh that sounded chillingly familiar. Then, a crushing blow to the side of his head. The world dissolved into a kaleidoscope of screaming pain and shadow. The last thing he heard before the blackness swallowed him whole was Sarah's terrified scream, a sound that was brutally cut short. He woke to the chirping of birds. For a blissful, idiotic moment, he thought it was just another morning. Then the pain slammed into him, a dull, throbbing agony in his head and a sharp, burning fire in his shoulder. Cold dawn light streamed through the shattered doorway. He pushed himself up, his vision swimming. The world came into focus with horrifying clarity. The cabin was destroyed. Furniture was overturned and smashed, stuffing pulled from cushions, their dinner plates crushed underfoot. A dark, ugly stain spread across the wooden floor near where he'd fallen. "Sarah," he rasped, his voice a dry, broken thing. "Eli." The silence that answered him was absolute, a heavy, suffocating blanket that was more terrifying than any scream. He staggered outside into the gray morning. The corral gate was broken open, his horses gone. Bullet holes peppered the walls of his home, the barn, everything he had built. And everywhere there was blood, not just his own. The rising sun was beginning to warm the cold, dew-soaked ground, glinting off a small, carved wooden horse lying forgotten in the dirt. His entire world had been soaked in blood and bullet holes, and his family was gone. The sun, once a welcome promise of a new day, was now a merciless interrogator, laying bare every detail of the nightmare. Jebediah staggered through the splintered doorway of his cabin, the raw agony in his shoulder, a distant echo of the gaping wound in his soul. Each familiar object was a fresh stab of pain. The overturned rocking chair, where Sarah would hum lullabies to Eli, the shattered remnants of their dinner plates, a single, small leather boot lying forlornly in a corner. He knelt, his hand trembling as he reached for it, the scent of his son still clinging to the worn leather. The grief was a physical force, a tidal wave that threatened to drown him. He choked, a dry, ragged sound tearing from his throat, but no tears came. They had been burned away in the fires of the night. He forced himself to his feet, a new, chilling clarity cutting through the fog of his despair. Grief was a luxury he could no longer afford. Survival, and something much darker, was now the only currency that mattered. His movements became deliberate, methodical. He began to read the scene not as a husband and father, but as a hunter. Outside, the churned-up dirt told a story. At least 5 horses, maybe 6. They had come from the north, from the direction of town, and had left heading south, deeper into the harsh, unforgiving brush country. Their tracks were heavy, laden with the weight of stolen lives. He followed the trail a short way, and his eyes caught the glint of brass in the dust. A spent cartridge casing. He picked it up, a .44 Colt, standard issue for a Texas Ranger. The final piece of doubt vanished, replaced by a cold, hard certainty that settled in his gut like a block of ice. Selah's cane. The instinct for self-preservation kicked in, a primal urge overriding his sorrow. He patched his bleeding shoulder with a strip torn from a bedsheet, hissing through his teeth at the searing pain. In the root cellar, miraculously untouched, he found a slab of jerky and a sack of grain for his one remaining horse, a tough mare named Dust Devil. He filled his canteen from the well, the rhythmic creak of the handle the only sound in the dead-silent morning. His Winchester was half buried under a collapsed section of the porch. He dug it out, wiped it clean, and checked the action. The familiar, solid click was a small comfort in a world turned upside down. Saddling the mare, he paused for a final look at the ruin of his life. His gaze fell upon a small, carved wooden horse in the dirt, a gift for Eli's last birthday. He picked it up, its smooth, worn shape a painful memory in his palm. He shoved it deep into his coat pocket. It was all he would take. He swung himself into the saddle, his wounded shoulder screaming in protest. He didn't look back. There was nothing left for him there but ghosts. He spurred Dust Devil forward, her hooves kicking up the dust of his shattered dreams, his eyes fixed on the southern horizon. The sun cast his long shadow before him, the silhouette of a man who had lost everything, now hunting the devil who had taken it. The Texas sun was a merciless hammer, beating down on the cracked earth and on Jebediah's uncovered head. The world had bleached to shades of brown and pale, shimmering yellow. All the color had been drained from his life, leaving only this harsh, glaring reality. He rode not like a rancher, but like a predator, his body low and coiled with a tension that never eased. Every sense was sharpened, honed by a singular, burning purpose. He read the land like a book he'd known his whole life. A dozen horses, maybe more. He noted the depth of the hoofprints, the way they were spaced, telling him they were moving fast but heavily burdened. One horse, shod with a distinctive nick on its right foreshoe, belonged to a ranger he'd seen in town, one of Cain's men. Another set of tracks, shallower and unsteady, spoke of a rider unaccustomed to such a grueling pace. Sarah. The thought was a shard of glass in his gut. He pushed it down, turning the pain into fuel. A flicker of movement on the horizon resolved into a lone hawk circling high above. For a piercing moment, its cry sounded like Eli's shout of joy as they played in the yard. The memory hit him with the force of a physical blow, stealing his breath. He saw his son's face, beaming with pure, innocent happiness. He saw Sarah, watching from the porch, her smile as warm as the morning sun. The mirage shattered, and the pain that followed was immense, a hollow ache in his chest. He gritted his teeth, the muscles in his jaw screaming. The grief was a fire, and he was forging it into something cold and hard. The sky, which had been a clear, unforgiving blue, began to bruise in the west. A dark line of clouds gathered with terrifying speed, a common feature of the plains that could turn a peaceful afternoon into a struggle for survival. The wind picked up, carrying the scent of rain and dust. The first fat drops were a brief relief, then a curse. The downpour came suddenly, a torrential sheet that turned the trail to mud and threatened to erase every trace of Cain's passage. Jebediah urged his horse under the meager shelter of a rocky overhang, watching the world dissolve into a gray, violent blur. He didn't curse the heavens. He simply waited, his patience as vast and unforgiving as the storm itself. When it passed, leaving the air clean and cool, he was on the move again. The ground was washed out, the tracks now a mess of churned mud. But he knew what to look for. A displaced stone, a broken branch at an unnatural angle, patches of earth darker than the surrounding soil. As dusk began to settle, painting the sky in strokes of orange and purple, he caught a scent on the damp air: wood smoke. He dismounted, tethering his horse quietly, and crept forward, rifle in hand. In a small clearing, a campfire was a circle of glowing embers, abandoned in a hurry. And there, half-pressed into the mud beside the dying fire, was a small, crudely carved wooden horse. Eli's. He had made it for him last winter. Jebediah picked it up, his knuckles white as he closed his fist around the small toy. They were close. The hunt was on. The small wooden horse felt heavy in Jebediah's hand, a leaden anchor pulling him back to a world of bedtime stories and gentle lullabies, a world that no longer existed. He tucked it safely inside his shirt, the carved wood a cold reminder against his skin. Night offered a hunter's cloak, and he used it, melting into the shadows of mesquite and rock. He didn't follow the trail directly but moved parallel to it, a ghost flitting through the rugged landscape, his eyes scanning the path ahead. He knew this land. He knew its rhythms, its hidden passages, its cruel deceptions. Hours before dawn, he found what he was looking for. A narrow arroyo, a natural bottleneck where the trail was forced between two steep, rocky walls. It was a perfect choke point, an ambush site. He settled himself high on the eastern ridge, the cold stone seeping into his bones as he lay in wait. The patience that had once served him in herding cattle now served a darker purpose. He was no longer a rancher. He was a predator. The main party, a dark smudge of men and horses, passed below him an hour later. They rode with a grim purpose, Cain at their head. Jebediah's heart hammered against his ribs, but he held his fire. A frontal assault was suicide. He waited. Just as he'd hoped, a lone rider lagged behind, his posture slumped with fatigue. This was his chance. He slid down the rock face as silent as a cougar and emerged onto the trail just as the straggler rounded the bend. The man's eyes widened in shock as he saw Jebediah standing there, rifle leveled. "Get down from the horse." Jebediah's voice was a low, gravelly sound he barely recognized. The man hesitated, his hand twitching towards his pistol. Jebediah didn't wait. He closed the distance in 2 quick strides and brought the butt of his rifle down hard on the man's forearm. A crack of bone echoed in the narrow pass, and the pistol clattered to the dusty ground. With a guttural cry, the man tumbled from his saddle. Jebediah was on him in an instant, the rifle barrel pressed hard under his chin. "Where is he taking them?" he snarled, the words torn from his throat. The man, sweating and pale with pain, just glared back with terrified defiance. "Talk, or this is the last sunrise you'll ever see." "Aguila Prieta," the man finally choked out, his bravado shattered. "It's an old presidio across the border. Cain has a deal selling horses, and them." The word hung in the air, a final, brutal confirmation. "Are they alive?" Jebediah demanded, his voice trembling with a storm of fear and rage. "Yeah. The woman, she's got fight. Cain's getting real tired of it." The man's eyes pleaded. "That's all I know, I swear. Let me go, please." Jebediah stared down at him, the man's life held in the balance. He saw not a person, but an obstacle, a loose end. A warning that could travel faster than he could. The cold logic of this new world was absolute. He couldn't let him go. Closing his eyes for a fraction of a second, he made the decision. The sound was sharp, ugly, and quickly swallowed by the vast, indifferent silence of the canyon. He stood over the body, the smell of gunpowder and blood acrid in the cool morning air. The hunter had made his first kill. There was no triumph, only the hollow, bitter taste of necessity. Taking the man's water and ammunition, he mounted the fresh horse and spurred it south, towards the promise of a fortress named Aguila Prieta. The weight of the dead man's rifle on his back was a constant, physical reminder of the line he had crossed. Riding south, Jebediah felt not guilt, but a chilling hollowness. The grief that had once burned like a wildfire had cooled into something harder, sharper. Every mile that passed stripped away another piece of the man he was, replacing it with the predator he had to become. The Texas landscape mirrored his soul, growing more arid and unforgiving. Jagged rocks and thorny mesquite replaced the familiar rolling hills of his home, a testament to the harsh reality he now inhabited. He rode for 2 days, the sun a merciless hammer overhead. The second horse, taken from his victim, provided a necessary advantage, allowing him to push onward without exhausting his own mount. He was a ghost moving through a dead land, his focus narrowed to a single point on the horizon: Mexico, the Rio Grande. He finally reached a dusty, dilapidated trading post squatting near the border, a last gasp of civilization before the wilderness of Mexico. It was little more than a sun-bleached adobe shack with a sagging porch. A sign, its letters faded by the relentless sun, read Cortez supplies and information. No credit for God or man. Jebediah dismounted, his movements deliberate, his eyes scanning every shadow. He was no longer a trusting rancher. He was a hunter in hostile territory. An old man with skin like wrinkled leather sat on the porch, cleaning a pistol with an oily rag. He looked up as Jebediah approached, his eyes sharp and assessing. "Looking for something or running from it?" the man asked, his voice raspy. "Information," Jebediah stated flatly, his hand never straying far from his Colt. "About a place, Aguila Prieta." The trader, Cortez, paused his cleaning. He squinted at Jebediah. "The Eagle's Nest. That's a bad place to be asking about. Worse place to be going. What's your business there?" "Personal," Jebediah said, his tone leaving no room for argument. He tossed a few coins onto a nearby barrel. They landed with a heavy clink. "I hear a Texas Ranger, Silas Kane, is heading there, with a woman and a boy." Cortez's gaze hardened with a flicker of understanding, perhaps even pity. He scooped up the coins. "Kane, yes, I've heard the name. He deals with the man who runs the nest, El Buiter, the vulture. He doesn't buy horses or cattle, amigo, he buys people. Aguila Prieta is not just a fort, it's his personal slaughterhouse. Walls are thick, and his men are loyal because they are paid in blood and fear. If Kane is taking your family there, he isn't ransoming them, he's selling them." The words hit Jebediah like a physical blow, confirming a fear he hadn't dared to voice. It wasn't just revenge anymore. It was a sale, a transaction. He bought a canteen of water and some dried jerky, his mind racing. Cortez watched him, a silent observer to a tragedy already in motion. Without another word, Jebediah turned and mounted his horse. He rode past the last vestiges of Texas and into the shallow, muddy waters of the Rio Grande. As he emerged onto the Mexican bank, he paused, looking back one last time at the country he had left behind. Ahead lay only desolation and the shadow of El Buiter's fortress. He was a lone man riding into hell, armed with nothing but a rifle, a pistol, and a promise he intended to keep. Aguila Prieta was a den of noise and vice, its shadows alive with drunken laughter and the scent of cheap mezcal. Jebediah moved through it like a wraith, a specter of vengeance cloaked by the night. He scaled a crumbling section of the outer wall where Cortez had said the guards were laziest, his calloused hands finding purchase on the rough adobe. Inside, he became one with the darkness, his rifle held low, his eyes scanning the chaotic courtyard. He saw him then. Silas Kane, swaggering out of the main cantina, followed by two of El Buiter's men. They headed toward a small, isolated building with a single barred window. Jebediah's heart hammered against his ribs, a cold, steady rhythm of purpose. He circled around, silent as a predator, and dealt with the lone guard at the door with the hilt of his Bowie knife. One swift, brutal motion. No sound but a dull thud. He kicked the door open. The scene inside froze him for a second, Sarah and Eli bound to chairs. El Buiter, a portly man with a cruel smile, was inspecting Eli like livestock. And Kane, his face flushed with triumph, turned with a snarl. "Stone, you should be dead." "You first," Jebediah replied, his voice a low growl. He fired before Kane could draw. The bullet tore through El Buiter's chest, who collapsed with a gurgle. The other two men drew their pistols, but Jebediah was already moving, using a heavy table for cover. A shot splintered the wood near his head. He returned fire, dropping one man, then the other, the small room filling with acrid smoke. Kane, scrambling for his gun, was all that was left. "You were nothing, Stone, a dirt kicker." He screamed, desperation cracking his voice. Jebediah didn't answer with words. He lunged, tackling Kane to the ground. It wasn't a duel, it was a savage, desperate struggle. Fists flew, a knife was drawn. Kane slashed wildly, catching Jebediah's arm. Jebediah grunted, ignoring the pain, and drove his own blade into the ranger's side. Kane's eyes went wide with shock, the fight draining out of him. He looked at Jebediah, a flicker of the arrogant man he'd been in the saloon, now extinguished by the cold reality of death. Jebediah stood, breathing heavily, the blood on his hands not feeling like his own. He rushed to his family, cutting the ropes. Sarah stared at him, her eyes wide with relief, love, and a sliver of fear at the man she saw before her, this hardened, lethal stranger who wore her husband's face. Eli just clung to his leg, sobbing quietly. Papa was all he could manage. Jebediah pulled them close. "It's over," he whispered, though he wasn't sure if it ever would be. They slipped out of the fortress as chaos erupted behind them, melting back into the desert night. By sunrise, they were across the Rio Grande, standing on Texas soil. The rising sun painted the sky in hues of orange and pink, a stark contrast to the blood and darkness they had left behind. Their ranch was gone, their innocence lost. Jebediah looked at his wife and son, then at his own blood-stained hands. He had saved them, but the farmer he once was had died back at the ranch. In his place stood a survivor, forever marked by the path he'd been forced to walk. They had a future, but it would be built upon the ashes of their past.